CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The World Health Organization warns that battling both the Omicron and Delta COVID variants is creating a tsunami of cases.
Our other headlines, the landmark court ruling in Germany after disabled people say they've been discriminated against during COVID.
The leaders of Russia and Belarus meet for talks amid plans to allow Alexander Lukashenko to stay in power for another decade.
Economies shutting down, then inflation shooting up. We look back on a roller coaster year in the world of high finance.
And despite the postponements of the pandemic, some good news at last. Europe's top dog show goes ahead.
The head of the World Health Organization has warned that the simultaneous circulation of the Omicron and Delta COVID variants is creating a tsunami of cases which threatens to overwhelm hospitals.
This on the day that the United States and many European countries reported record COVID cases, though some experts have urged caution because of Christmas reporting delays.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Benji Hire in Brussels. Benji, how worrying are these record numbers of cases?
Well, those tsunami of infections that the WHO were referring to just a few hours ago illustrated quite starkly across the European continent. If we begin with France, that recorded 200,000 COVID-19 cases over the last 24 hours, that is a national and a European record, and France not alone in posting those sorts of figures. Similar sort of numbers in terms of the records that we're seeing coming from much of European states as well. That is obviously concerning, especially as other waves in the past have led to nations finding that their health services are overwhelmed. The light relief when it comes to sort of Omicron is the studies that have shown that this is a more mild strain compared to those previous variants. But the concern still exists amongst a number of EU states that if enough people are catching this more transmissible variant, then that's still going to lead to a significant number of individuals needing hospital care, especially if they are unvaccinated. And that's really a strong message that's being sent by the WHO, that vaccines are indeed the way out of this crisis. And WHO taking a long time in this press conference early this afternoon to essentially stress that it's not just developed and Western countries that need to be vaccinating their citizens, but this needs to be rolled out comprehensively across the entire world, that in nations that have not yet had enough boosters, had enough first shots or even second shots, never mind boosters, that there needs to be a rollout that means that 70% of populations there have access to that vaccine. It is, in the words of the WHO's Director General, the way out of this crisis, tackling vaccine inequity.
As I said earlier, you will join us. Please join the campaign to vaccinate 70% of population of all countries by mid-2022. We have 185 days to go. It's possible to do it, and I ask for every citizen of the world to join the campaign.
Benji, many countries considering shortening isolation times. What more can you tell us on that?
That's right. It's an interesting one, really, because you see from the likes of France and other EU states that have put in restrictions the fact that they're still tackling this particular variant. And yet, in neighbouring countries, you find the likes of Italy saying that actually we need to be tackling this variant in a different sort of way, treating it more like pneumonia or the flu that arises every single year, and in that sense reduce the isolation time for people with coronavirus from 7 days to just 3 days if they have been boosted with that third jab. It's a conversation that's also taking place in Spain that follows that announcement by the Centre for Disease Control in America that reduced its isolation period from 10 days to 5 days for those that don't have any symptoms. Essentially, there's a battle going on here in Europe by those that are still concerned about the impact that this new variant in particular could have, and those that are trying to move away from coronavirus as a pandemic, get their populations vaccinated, and, to echo the words of the WHO Director General, move into 2022 at a time when we can put this virus very much in the past.
Benji High, our correspondent in Brussels, thank you very much.
3 of the UK's 4 nations have already introduced tougher measures in the face of surging COVID infections. But UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is resisting changes in England, saying a high rate of vaccinations mean current guidance can continue. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Naweed Jabakal, who's outside a vaccination centre in London. So, Naweed, no new regulations in England, but staff absences causing major problems in the public services, especially the health service.
Yeah, we've been hearing about some of those record figures over in Europe. It's no different here in the UK. On Tuesday, 130,000 cases reported in COVID-19 infections. The data, it must be said, there are a few caveats because Scotland and Northern Ireland haven't reported the latest data for the 28th of December, whereas England and Wales have. Either way, they are record numbers, and it's causing concern, particularly for frontline services. The National Health Service worried that with cases rising, it may cause a lot of pressure on their services at a time which is traditionally a very, very busy period for them. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been out and about today at a vaccination centre like this one. Pharmacies across the UK currently being used as vaccination centres to try and give everyone a booster jab or a third dose of the coronavirus before the end of the month. We're just a few days away from that, and the target's still short by about 2.5 million people. But the Prime Minister insisting that people who are unvaccinated or who haven't even had a third dose of the vaccine, even if you're double jabbed but not triple jabbed, you still could be at greater risk.
And I'm sorry to say this, but the overwhelming majority of people who are currently ending up in intensive care in our hospitals are people who are not boosted. I've talked to doctors who say the numbers are running up to 90% of people in intensive care who are not boosted. If you're not vaccinated, you're 8 times more likely to get into hospital altogether. So it's a great thing to do.
And the problem is it's not just in terms of people who may end up in hospital or deaths, but also the rest of the economy that's suffering as well. The hospitality industry, for example, today, businesses there are pushing the government to try and cut the self-isolation period that we've just been hearing is being shared among other parts of Europe as well. What's happened on the other side of Atlantic is having ripple effects here. There are some scientists, there are plenty of businesses who are calling on the government to cut the self-isolation period to just 5 days like they've done in the United States. So far, ministers say there are no plans to do so. And remember, just last week, the UK did its own shortening of its measures. It cut it from 10 days down to 7, and only then you're allowed to leave self-isolation with a negative lateral flow test on day 6 and 7. So far, ministers are resisting this, but it does seem like pressure is growing for them to follow suit, particularly with staff shortages on the front line of the health sector as well. The National Health Service says up to 20,000 people were off work in December. That's going to affect frontline services. And here in London, that figure is almost 1 in 4 NHS workers currently off work or self-isolating.
And Naweed, London, one of the places across the UK where New Year celebrations have been cancelled.
Yeah, and this is an issue that's facing mayors across Europe as well. Here in London, the New Year's Eve celebrations, traditionally something that attracts a lot of global attention. They've been cancelled for the 2nd year running. Sadiq Khan made that decision earlier this month, trying to move early on this. We've seen Paris take a similar decision, but it's not everywhere in Europe. Madrid, for example, says its celebrations will go ahead, but they're urging people to try and celebrate safely at home if they can and reduce the numbers congregating in public areas. Now, the interesting thing here about the United Kingdom is that there are 4 countries charting their own course when it comes to the pandemic. In Scotland, Hogmanay celebrations, as they're called, traditionally very, very busy. They've been cancelled in Scotland. Wales and Northern Ireland taking a very cautious approach, whereas in England, Boris Johnson, speaking earlier today, said people should be cautious. They should go about celebrating New Year's, but that they had to think about others when they were doing so. So we're seeing this fractured approach, not just here in the UK, but in other parts of Europe. But as things stand, the key message is that Omicron, according to officials, remains a danger and that people should take care, even if they do celebrate, which they're allowed to do here in England.
OK, Nui Jabarkal in London, thank you.
Disabled people in Germany are celebrating a landmark legal ruling which challenged the way they're treated in hospitals. Germany's highest court says new legislation will now be needed. Our correspondent Trent Murray reports.
Well, this ruling by Germany's Constitutional Court sets a really significant precedent for protecting people with disabilities. The court ruled that German politicians must legislate to protect those with disabilities or pre-existing conditions if they find themselves in a hospital triage situation. Triage is the process of when doctors prioritise who to treat in high-pressure situations and is often based on the overall chances of survival of the patient. The court said that during the pandemic, lawmakers had violated the German constitution, specifically the clause which states, quote, "No person shall be disfavoured because of disability." The court has been deliberating this issue since early 2020, but as Europe endures another big wave of COVID-19, the case took on added urgency, given that hospitals are under increased pressure, especially with the onset of winter. Responding to the ruling, Germany's Justice Minister said laws are already being drafted to follow the court's directive, with legislation expected to be presented to Parliament in the new year. Laws which will ensure that a person's disability or pre-existing condition doesn't affect their chances of treatment in overstretched hospitals. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
The presidents of Russia and Belarus have met in St. Petersburg. The talks between Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko come amid plans to change the Belarus constitution, which would allow Lukashenko to stay in power until 2035. Belarus Defence Ministry has also confirmed that fighter jets from both countries conducted a joint border patrol on Wednesday. Also on the agenda for those talks, the current tensions between both countries and the West. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Julia Chapman, who's in Moscow. So, Julia, let's talk about that joint border patrol exercise between Russia and Belarus. What does that tell us about relations between them?
There's no doubt that relations still continue to be pretty solid between Russia and Belarus, despite a few differences between the two leaders. There's certainly, of course, between the two countries a number of disputes, but they have been joining together, particularly militarily, in increasing frequency in recent weeks and months. We've seen a number of these joint patrols, and although we don't have the details of where Wednesdays were carried out, previous ones have been held on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border and also on the Belarusian-Polish border, which of course was a flashpoint for the migrant crisis earlier this year. But certainly there are growing areas of cooperation with regards to defense capability between Russia and Belarus, with the Lukashenko regime offering Russia to put any of its nuclear weapons in Belarus should NATO or the US put any of theirs in Eastern Europe, certainly underscoring that the tensions between Russia and the West would certainly see some form of support from Belarus.
And Julia, these new plans for constitutional change in Belarus, what's been the response to those?
It hasn't been very positive, at least from the Belarusian opposition. This constitutional amendment proposal from the Lukashenko government was offered as a sort of olive branch to all of those protesters that took to the streets in Belarus following the 2020 presidential election, which they said was rigged. And certainly many of the high-profile opposition figures had to flee Belarus in the subsequent months. The most high-profile of them, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition opposition leader says that these proposals that have been put forward don't offer Belarusians a real choice. She wants to see fresh elections in the country, and some of these amendments that are being put forward to the Belarusian people in a referendum in February include, in fact, revisiting the possibility of having term limits, which were removed in a previous referendum, but that would only come into effect after the next election, which would effectively give Alexander Lukashenko another 14 years in power, should he so choose.
And then, Julia, you mentioned the migrant crisis. There are fears in Brussels that another migrant standoff could be on the way.
That's right. There are still a number of Middle Eastern migrants living in Belarus in temporary shelters and in camps. Of course, after there was a big crisis earlier this year with the Belarusian government accused of using these people to put pressure on the European Union by encouraging them into Belarus, facilitating their passage and encouraging them towards the EU border. That led to a big standoff between the EU and Belarus. Many of those migrants ended up returning home to their countries, many of them from Iraq, returning on repatriation flights. Nevertheless, there are some that say they want to remain there. They want to travel onwards into the European Union. And certainly Alexander Lukashenko would like to see them do that. We know that many have actually made it through that route despite the fortifications on the Polish border. But it's possible that as winter goes on, as spring emerges, there could still be a lot of tension with more migrants trying to move through that passage.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, thanks very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, no time to rest. The judge in the sex trafficking trial of Ghislaine Maxwell tells the jury coronavirus means no days off.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshot. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Beijing.
The world's fastest skaters coming in with speed and balance.
Figure skaters showcasing their elegance and precision are expected to shine.
Intensity and power. Will ice hockey get spectators jumping out of their seats?
A sport of focus and concentration. Curling is arguably the game's most strategic event.
The 2022 Winter Games are here. Join us for all the action, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com, the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
The judge in the trial of British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell has extended the jury's working hours due to a rise in COVID cases. The judge said that any positive case among the jurors could risk a mistrial. Maxwell's accused of recruiting and grooming teenage girls for sex with her former boyfriend, financier Jeffrey Epstein, charges she denies. Let's talk now to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. So, John, the jury taking its time on this one.
Yeah, hey Robin, hey Jamie, and just so our viewers know, this is all taking place in the vicinity of where I am. I'm at the Stock Exchange at the moment in Lower Manhattan, but just around the corner is Foley Square, and that is where the case is playing out at the moment. And you're absolutely right, they really are taking their time. They had Christmas off, but they've been debating for the best part of a week now. And the Manhattan Federal Court judge in charge of the case, who's called Allison Nathan, has said to the jury, look, I really want you to extend your hours by at least an hour every day. So whatever you were thinking of deliberating for, will you please tack on at least another 60 minutes? Now, the jury has said in the past 48 hours that they're nowhere near a decision or a verdict, but they've also said within the last 24 that they're in a good place. So we assume from that that they are getting there. And I know that Judge Nathan is very worried that COVID-19, particularly the Omicron variant, is going to sweep through the jury pool and that they're going to have to end deliberations while members of the jury go home and recover. And she's trying to avoid that from happening. Now, I think we all think here in Lower Manhattan that she's likely, therefore, to keep them in place right the way through the end of this week. So it is entirely possible that we won't have a decision from the jury, a verdict, until Friday, which is New Year's Eve. Now, I've just spoken to Simon, who is one of our senior producers who is monitoring this case on a minute-by-minute basis, and he tells me that the jury has just asked the judge to send in 5 more documents for their perusal and deliberation. Now, as you say, Ghislaine Maxwell, by the way, she spent her 60th birthday in jail here in New York on Saturday, on Christmas Day. She is accused of recruiting and grooming young girls for her friend or lover, depending on how you want to couch it, Jeffrey Epstein, who, of course, committed suicide last year in jail in the same location pretty much where Ghislaine Maxwell is being held. The feeling among everybody outside the courthouse is the longer the deliberations go on, the better it is for Ghislaine Maxwell, particularly when it comes potentially to avoiding the most serious charge or charges against her. Of course, we don't know. We absolutely have no idea, but certainly the jury is taking it very, very seriously and taking their time. Robin?
Well, John, let's change the subject now and talk about the S&P, which missed its 70th record.
Yes. Well, I told you yesterday that we were heading towards the 70th record for the S&P 500, and this is basically happening because money is pouring into stocks because there's really nowhere else for it to go. I mean, the housing market's pretty good, but bonds are really not very good. So now that this Omicron thing is out of the way as far as the markets are concerned, this is where the money is heading. And yesterday, in the end, the S&P 500, which is the broad market, has about 505 or 6 stocks in it, and it did hit a high during the day. It was what they call an intraday high, but it couldn't hang on to it, and at the close of business on Tuesday it was down by about 0.1%, only about 4 points, but not a closing record. Technology, energy, healthcare all lagging on Tuesday, but now today is Wednesday morning here and the risk is back on, because it does look, if they keep going as they are, that the Dow and the S&P 500 will hit new records. So we could have the S&P at a 70th record for 2021. At the moment, the Dow is up between a 10th and a 5th. The Nasdaq is down. Tech was very badly hit yesterday over at the Nasdaq after 4 strong days of gains. Nasdaq's down about just over 1/10 of 1%. And the S&P is up 4 points, making up for yesterday. So we're heading towards that 70th record. Overall, by the way, US stocks are up about 25% for the year. I know there are some stocks that have been beaten up. I know there are some hedge fund managers who are down about 25 or 30%. But if you put them all together, it's all up by about 25% compared to how it was at the beginning of the year. We'll see how we go in the next 2 days.
And John, you say tech had a bad day yesterday, but Apple, on the other hand, nearing $3 trillion.
I know. Well, this happened last week, and it's amazing to everybody because it hit $1 trillion, and before we could all turn around, here it is almost at a $3 trillion mark, and that is bigger than many, many, many economies of countries in the world. Quite extraordinary, really. It needs to hit 182.85. At the moment, it is up. It stands at 179.66, but it was down last week to about 175, so it's making progress towards the $3 trillion mark. And just to stay with Apple, if I may, yesterday I reported, because it was true, that Apple was closing its stores in New York and elsewhere around the country because of the Omicron variant. And then long after we were on the air yesterday, I went to one and there were people in there. And I said, I thought you were closing the stores. And they said, you didn't read our latest news release. And sure enough, I hadn't. And what happened was customers complained so much that they decided to open the stores again with a very limited number of people going in them. But you have to know what you want to buy. It's no browsing. Okay, so you can't go in and spend 20 minutes perusing the stuff. You have to say to them, I want an iPhone. They say, right, there it is over there. Pick it up, pay, get out. So that's what's happening at Apple right now.
John, thanks for updating us. John Terrett there in New York.
All right, thank you.
Well, as John intimated, it's been a roller coaster year for economies around the world, particularly the Eurozone. 2021 began with lockdowns. But then there was an economic surge as restrictions were eased somewhat. CGTN's Ryan Thompson spent much of the year in Frankfurt. I asked for his take on turbulent times.
Yeah, here in Frankfurt, we began the year with the Eurozone economy really at a standstill. Shops were shut, hospitality was on hold. If you looked at air travel, those planes were no longer taking to the sky. And really, every time it seemed like we were going to make some progress away from these surging infections, there was just bad news around the corner. And it became increasingly hard to predict when Europe's economy would be able to reopen. That did finally happen in June, with at least a partial reopening here in Europe's largest economy, in Germany, joining other economies that had reopened just weeks earlier, like France, Italy, and Spain. And what's interesting to note here is Europe's economy really came surging back, fighting back after what was an incredibly tough area. The Euro area saw growth that topped the US and China over the summer, with investment really booming, unemployment falling, and the EU was able to reach this target of having over 70% of adults vaccinated, something rarely seen in some other parts of the world.
Ryan, let's look at the year to come. Low inflation has been the story for Germany and the wider EU for years and years. Now inflation, of course, is rising fast with consequences for the cost of living, political and economic decisions across the EU. Inflation is going to be an important story in 2022, isn't it?
Well, the big thing that I'll be watching is inflation really as transitory as everyone says it is? Because currently it's far above 4%, levels that were really unimaginable at the start of this coronavirus crisis. If you look at the consumer price index, which tells us how much we're paying for goods, for example, here in Germany, well, it's up 6% from the start of the year, which is levels not seen before in Germany since reunification. These are big, big things to talk about. And really, inflation has been on an upward trend since last spring. Economists kept saying it would come down at the end of the summer, but they're constantly revising these financial forecasts over and over again. And interestingly enough here, the ECB, which has a target of at or near 2%, is allowing it to go ahead, really playing around with it, saying that the growth overall that is coming with this inflation is good for the Eurozone. But of course, they at the same time are engaged in a $1 billion asset purchasing program that is, pandemic emergency response. And there are calls for them to really begin to taper that in line with taming this inflation and potentially getting a better hold on it before Q1 of 2022.
Well, returning to Apple for a moment, and it's put one of its Indian plants on probation after finding that workers' dormitories and canteens didn't meet hygiene standards. The Foxconn factory near Chennai employs 17,000 staff making iPhones and other Apple products for India. Earlier this month, 250 staff at another Foxconn site in India suffered food poisoning after eating in factory canteens.
The Swedish battery maker Northvolt says it's starting production of a new lithium-ion car battery, the first to be designed, developed and assembled by a European company. Most of the world's electric car batteries are currently made in the United States and Asia. Production will begin next Tuesday.
Elon Musk has sold more shares in Tesla, worth just over $1 billion. The boss of the electric car firm has now released more than $16 billion in stock as he tries to offload 10% of his stake in the company. The move will also help to cut a large income tax bill.
Brazil has a new stock market aimed specifically at helping businesses in the country's poorer communities, known as favelas.
Our correspondent Paulo Cabral has been finding out how it works.
Costurando Sonhos, Sewing Dreams is a social impact startup that began in the favela do Paraisópolis, one of Brazil's biggest slums, in 2019, with the goal of starting a fashion label while training female victims of sexual violence to work in the fashion industry. They built a profitable brand. Their founders feel it's time to invest in growth, so they are preparing the company to list on the Favela Stock Exchange, a market modeled after traditional stock markets, but focusing on businesses created in Brazil's poorest communities.
Eu acho que as pessoas precisam olhar para favelas.
People need to see the inside of the favelas and realize there are huge opportunities. In the favelas, we can create solutions that will help in the development of Brazil. We are not adventurers in our business. All have a strong social component, but are also structured as businesses. So investors can be sure their savings will be in good hands.
Until now, one business has IPO'd in this new stock market. The company, Favela Brasil Express, is a service that delivers products to previously inaccessible places in slums, often to homes that have no official addresses.
The idea behind the Favela Stock Exchange is to generate capital for entrepreneurs while allowing their communities to share in their prosperity.
The Favela Stock Exchange is the brainchild of one community leader who's also one of the creators of the G10 Bank, a financial institution founded in 2021 by representatives of 10 slums across the country to provide loans ranging from $200 to $3,000 to local entrepreneurs. Gilson Rodrigues says that over 500 favela businesses have expressed interest in listing on this exchange, where initial investments begin with 10 Brazilian reais, less than $2 US.
O empreendedor tem que apresentar alguns critérios.
The entrepreneurs need to fulfill some criteria to participate in the stock exchange, and when they are not ready, we offer mentoring to formalize their businesses. We also help them to create a business plan and find out more precisely how much money they actually need to invest.
Often the first thing that comes to mind in relation to Brazil's favelas is the poverty and the violence in these communities. But there are also business opportunities and an entrepreneurial spirit that, given a chance to develop, could help change the harsh realities in these slums. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Paulo.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a summer that saw unprecedented fires in the Mediterranean. We'll be meeting the families trying to rebuild their lives.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? grey rhinos, and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories: the World Health Organization warns that it's battling both the Omicron and Delta COVID variants, which is creating a tsunami of cases.
A landmark court ruling in Germany after disabled people say they have been discriminated against during COVID.
The leaders of Russia and Belarus meet for talks amid plans to allow Alexander Lukashenko to stay in power for another decade.
The summer of 2021 saw unprecedented forest fires in Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean.
Homes and livelihoods were lost to the flames. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas has been catching up with families trying to rebuild their lives.
It has been 4 months since the devastating fires north of Athens, and burned trees and destroyed houses still dominate the scenery. It is here that Aris restaurant once stood. It's here where he saw his life savings and dreams destroyed by the flames in a matter of hours. Now he's come back once again, trying to recreate this year's holiday preparations and everything else in his life.
How can I celebrate the holidays without money? Without my business, I can't work. The Christmas break is usually the best time for us, when we get a lot of income. I really don't know if things will ever be the same. We've lost everything. We're in debt, with a lot of bills and nothing coming in.
During last summer, multiple fires broke out in Greece, burning thousands of hectares of farmland and pine forest, as well as hundreds of houses, and forcing the evacuation of thousands. At its peak, firefighters were called out to some 500 fire fronts in just a few days. In Evia, the Peloponnese, in Crete, Rhodes, central and northern Greece, and just north of the Greek capital, as the country experienced its worst heat wave in more than 3 decades, recording temperatures up to 47 degrees Celsius. Here in Athens, emergency services faced a race against time to put out the flames as they engulfed residential areas. But as Aris explains, everything happened really fast and he had no time to react.
The first fire started up there. They couldn't put it out. The second started from the other side and moved towards the village. The first one was an hour away and the second about 3 hours away. Both of them were out of control and burning everything in their path. A few days later, another fire started on the other side of the village and burned everything that was left in our town. We had no time. The only thing was to evacuate, to avoid people dying.
Here in Varipopi, the destruction is still visible. There's a smell of burned wood, burned houses, and burned businesses. Where once Christmas parties took place with people drinking and socializing, now broken plates and melted glasses, a reminder that this place once had life. When the fires began, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said that houses can be rebuilt. It's time now to save your lives. 4 months later, those exact words are stuck in Aris' head, and his business remains destroyed.
Apparently, I'm not eligible for any government support because I have insurance. They told me that I can't make any claims other than from my insurance company. But I'm worried. My insurance won't pay my salary or continue to run my business. Who will pay my living?
The holiday season is well underway, with people rushing to do last-minute shopping and planning their holidays. But for people like Aris, who lost all they had, their biggest challenge now is making a holiday among the ashes. Evangelo Sipsas for CGTN, Athens.
The fires in Greece were one of several extreme weather events which scientists say were driven by climate change. In November, world leaders gathered in Glasgow for talks aimed at limiting global warming. Isabel Hilton is the founder of China Dialogue and was one of the delegates at COP26. I asked her what was achieved in Scotland.
Well, it's quite hard to compare this year with last year, for example, in terms of emissions because of the pandemic. Global emissions, really crashed in 2020, and they have come back in 21. So these are anomalous numbers. So if we were looking at action, a lot of the action that was pledged or that will happen or that has happened was around the big climate conference in Glasgow, COP26. And that was pretty dramatic, We've now got 137 countries out of the 192 in the UN, and that's 80% of global emissions. They have pledged to achieve net zero, and that's a really big step forward. So there was a big surge of activity and excitement.
You yourself were at COP26 in Glasgow. What were your impressions? We had lots of targets being set, but did you feel that it was really being taken seriously?
I did certainly get a much greater sense of urgency at COP26 than in previous COPs. And there was a political statement which was an innovation, which kind of set the tone for the whole thing, which everybody agreed. And that essentially said this is an existential crisis for humanity. It named fossil fuels as a primary cause of climate change. You might think after 26 COPs that wasn't such a radical step, but some countries resisted.
And we also had this agreement, didn't we, between the United States and China. How significant is that?
It was an uplifting moment because, as it's no secret that the US and China have not been getting on. And unlike Paris, where there was a very positive dynamic between them, in Glasgow it was pretty standoffish. So I think it was a tribute to the persistence of John Kerry and Xie Jianhua, who are both climate warriors who know each other. They managed to at least keep this cooperation going. It's not hugely significant yet in terms of climate impacts, but it will depend how much work the joint working group that they have also set up as part of this agreement, how effective that is. And for example, China did not join the global methane pledge, but in the US-China agreement, there is an agreement to work on China's methane emissions.
So moving from governments to businesses, how motivated are they to go green? What's in place to help them?
The UK government, for example, has announced that it will be legally, that businesses will be legally obliged to publish their own net zero plans, and that they are working to set up a globally accepted standard for delivery, so that if we suspect a company is producing a plan that is largely greenwash, there will be something to measure it against. So that's a really important beginning to getting a much more rigorous look and forcing businesses to be more transparent, more accountable in their own operations, and to commit themselves to net zero. So that's progress, that's encouraging. And I think on the investment side, there's an increasing realization that investing in fossil fuels, investing in high-emitting sectors, you're going to lose money. You're investing in stranded assets. And there was a real sense that the future was in sustainable development and in low-carbon investments. And if that is the case, then that's where the money will go.
China has published its plans for low-carbon development. CO2 emissions are set to peak in the next 8 years, with the country becoming carbon neutral by 2060. Guo Tianqi reports.
China believes its energy transition will inevitably be painful, but it says it is striving to achieve carbon emission goals through a combination of industry experts and scholars. The country's State Power Investment Corporation has co-written a report with the China Center for International Economic Exchanges, which touches the energy trilemma. It says the global situation makes clear that energy security, equality, and ecology need dynamic balance through proper policies.
Enterprises provide practice to think tanks, and think tanks can reflect on the difficulties of enterprises up to the decision-making level.
In China, most state-owned energy firms are leading the transition to renewable sources. This year alone, the 5 major power generation groups investigated a total of 353 million kilowatts in new energy. Analysts say China's carbon goals also set a new growth point for its economy.
欧盟可能需要28万亿欧元的投资。而我们国家呢
The European Union needs to invest $31 trillion to achieve carbon neutrality. China needs $21 trillion to achieve the same goal. This provides a huge space for industry iteration.
China also launched some large-scale measures this year aimed at carbon reduction, such as power rationing. At a key economic work conference, however, officials noted that actions should be in moderation.
Experts say China's carbon target must be based on its coal-based energy grid and ensure reducing emissions don't come at the cost of energy security and the economy. 郭天琪 CGTN 北京
China has strongly denied claims of genocide or forced labour in its Xinjiang region, accusing a UK tribunal of spreading lies. Officials from China's UK embassy cited social and economic progress in Xinjiang over the past 2 years and said individual case testimonies at the tribunal had twisted facts. It comes after the unofficial tribunal ruled that Uyghur people in Xinjiang had been subjected to crimes against humanity.
A self-proclaimed Uyghur tribunal, the domain suffix of their website being .com, carried out 2 hearings and issued the so-called judgment. It was nothing but a joke. In fact, the so-called evidence was either far-fetched or completely fabricated. The so-called witnesses were all paid actors. The so-called hearings were well-rehearsed performances. And the so-called judgments was a downright lie.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, who will be top dog in Hungary? Europe's dog show goes ahead despite all those pandemic postponements.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. South Africa will continue to trace contacts of people infected with COVID after a backlash over plans to scrap the process. The authorities have planned to stop contract tracing, with some exceptions, such as schools and prisons. They say most people have already been exposed to the virus through vaccination or infection. The revised protocols were withdrawn after the Department of Health was inundated with complaints.
Australia is easing COVID restrictions despite a surge in cases. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said a change is needed to ease pressure on overburdened testing sites and to get people out of unnecessary isolation. PCR tests will only now be required for those with symptoms, while isolation periods for close contacts will be cut to 7 days.
Another Hong Kong media group is shutting down after it was raided by the police. 7 current and former employees of Stand News were arrested for conspiracy to publish seditious publications. The news website rose to prominence during the protests in Hong Kong in 2019. Critics say it's an assault on the city's press freedom.
Mourners in South Africa have been paying tributes to the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who died on Sunday at the age of 90. Prayers have been held in Cape Town for the Nobel Peace Prize-winning activist who spearheaded the fight against the country's apartheid regime. His body will lie in state for 2 days.
Now, amidst all of the postponements in the pandemic, some good news at last. The European Dog Show is going ahead in Budapest.
The event will see thousands of dogs from all around the world, and their owners, of course, gather in the Hungarian capital. Andrzej Nagy reports.
Some have a lot of hair, others less so. Smaller or bigger, obedient or perhaps lazy. Man's best friend can take many forms. This year, for the first time since 2008, the world's dog community is meeting in Budapest. The European Dog Show is one of the world's most important international canine events held annually in different countries. This year's event is taking place despite the pandemic.
There is a huge international interest, with dog people from 57 countries coming to participate. Until the last minute, it was questionable whether we could organise this event. We monitored the epidemic data on a daily basis. Out of the 20 to 22,000 dogs entering the competitions, 80 to 90% will turn up for this 4-day event. We could organise a full European dog show in Budapest.
The pandemic has presented many challenges for the organisers.
After cancelling the show in 2019 and 2020 as well, this year's event was in limbo for a long time. Originally, organisers had hoped to hold it earlier this year in May.
Visitors are only able to enter the venue with a COVID-negative PCR test or an immunity certificate. For some people, their four-legged friends have been valuable company during the pandemic and periods of quarantine, which is why many more people around the world have recently become dog owners.
The number of registered dogs has increased dramatically and is still growing. We see a yearly increase of 4,000 to 5,000 registered pups only in Hungary. Many people were looking for puppies during the pandemic. A lot of them thought that they needed to be able to get out of the house with a dog to go for a walk.
However, dog experts warn that ownership is a huge responsibility, not just for the duration of the pandemic, but for life. They warn against leaving dogs alone all day and ensuring they are taken out often to give them the best possible care. Do that, they say, and you will get back the energy you invested many times over in the form of love from your four-legged friend. András Nagy, CGTN, Budapest.
And while we're celebrating animal magic in 2021, who could forget the herd of wild elephants from China who embarked on an unprecedented journey? Our reporter Yung Jinghao has the story.
I'm here at the Xishuangbanna Nature Reserve in Yunnan Province, a major habitat for Asian elephants. Last year, a herd of the giant animals left and went on an epic northward journey that captured worldwide attention. Over a year on, they've come back to these tropical rainforests, safe and sound. During the 1,000-plus kilometer trek, they tramped over mountains, strolled around urban areas, raided farmlands, and snuck into local farmers' homes. Shen Qingzhong is an expert for a government-led special mission. He says the migration provided a rare opportunity to learn more about the gigantic mammals.
I was surprised to see how they climbed over the high flat wall, especially a baby elephant. It was totally beyond my expectations, and we found that the animal has a stronger ability to adjust to new environments than we thought.
Behind the safe return were efforts by government officers, experts, and residents along the way, conducting round-the-clock monitoring, building temporary roadblocks, and preparing various food for the elephants. A task force took every possible means to protect the animals from harm or from disrupting human communities. A special swimming pool was even built before they set foot on a bridge leading to a suitable habitat.
They would have been exhausted after such a long trek. The pond provided them a place to drink and have fun. This not only helped them cool down, but they could also get some nutrients their bodies needed.
Shen and other experts say policymakers should reflect on the incident to ensure a comfortable habitat with abundant food for the elephants.
And we need to increase elephant habitat, particularly elephant habitat without much contact with people. So in that sense, China is now planning a new national park. I think that's a very good thing.
Their homecoming may be the end of the journey, but it heralds the start of another pressing mission, which calls on society to engage in the protection of wildlife. Yang Jinghao, CGTN, Yunnan Province.
And finally, a box containing items from the United States Civil War has been opened for the first time in more than 130 years. It was found in the pedestal of a removed Confederate statue in the state of Virginia. The time capsule contains documents, books, and ammunition dating from the war, which ended in 1865. Historians say the find is significant and in better condition than expected.
The headlines again. The World Health Organization has warned that battling both the Omicron and Delta COVID variants is creating a tsunami of cases.
Our other headlines, a landmark court ruling in Germany after disabled people say they've been discriminated against during coronavirus.
And the leaders of Russia and Belarus meet for talks amid plans to allow Alexander Lukashenko to stay in power for another decade.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com, the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.